And it's time for Creation Ministries International. And we have our very special guest, Dr. Mark again, same as last week. He's here to talk to us about, well, he's an expert on all things outer space. He's a rocket scientist, of course, and we'd love you to send your questions in, 0401 949 949. And, when I say rocket scientist, you put satellites in the sky. That's right, isn't it, Dr. Mark?
Well, that's right. Yes, I was involved in the design of Australia's national satellite system. That's right. Yeah, and it's great to be on the program, Nick.
It's good to have you. Of course, people can go to creation.com anytime to get their questions answered, but we'd love it if you could send your questions into our text line, 0401 949 949. And they can be questions in regards to, anything to do with creation or evolution. That's the big one with Creation Ministries. But of course, it might have something to do with aging or dinosaurs or aliens or space. And the other thing we talk about is news articles that have come out during the week. And Dr. Mark, we had some interesting ones this week. A headline that I saw in Science Alert said, "Rocks from Mars are hitting Earth and something is odd about their age."
Yeah, that's right. That's right. What they've done here, Mick, is that they've dated some of these rocks using a radiometric dating technique, and they're getting numbers which are way too young for the model that scientists have of how our solar system formed and how long ago. And our solar system is believed to be 4.5 billion years old in the sort of secular science Big Bang view. And what they're finding is that some of these rocks are returning radioisotope ages of only a couple of 100 million years, which is much, much shorter than what they expected. So it's caused a little bit of a discussion, I guess, and they're trying to work out how can rocks so young be there. I guess from a biblical point of view, though, we would believe that God created the heavens and the earth just like he said he did in Genesis chapter 1, and that would have happened about 6,000 years ago, not hundreds of millions or even billions of years.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason these things are giving them a bit of a problem is that the radiometric dating techniques are not actually absolute dating methods, which they're often presented that way, but they're not, because they all depend on a certain number of assumptions that have to be made. And the way it works roughly is that you have a radioactively unstable parent element, as it's called, and it decays into a daughter element. And if you can measure the ratio of the parent to the daughter in your rock sample, then you can calculate the age. Now, some of these radiometric dating methods they use have very, very long half-lives. That is the time it takes for half of the parent to decay away. And I'm talking here of sometimes into billions of years. So not surprisingly, if the dates that they produce are always going to be very long.
Well, if a half-life is that long, how can they even possibly measure the first half-life?
Well, if they can measure some daughter element, they interpret that as meaning that it's all come from the parent, and therefore it must have come by the process of radioactive decay, and therefore it must be hundreds and hundreds of millions of years old, which is why they keep getting very old ages for these things. But the problem with it is, Mick, that no one knows what the original rock looked like when it was made, how many atoms of daughter element were there compared to the parent, and you have to make a whole raft of assumptions. And there's actually no way of testing those assumptions, because you can't go back to look at the original rock. You haven't got that. All you've got is what your sample is in front of you. But it is interesting that they're coming out a lot younger than what they expected. So they're kind of a bit perplexed by that, and they're scratching around trying to come up with some explanations of what might be happening and so on.
When you say younger, they're saying millions of years younger.
Oh, yeah, they're saying about 200 million years old for a planet that they think is 4,500 billion years old. Sorry, 4,500 million years old.
So they're not even the same ballpark.
No, they're not. They're much, much younger than what they're expecting, and hence the surprise. And that's why it's hit the headlines. Now, these aren't sort of very recent. These have been landing over, lots of years, and they collect them. The reason they figured out they're from Mars is because the geochemical properties of these rocks are quite different from what we have on the Earth. And we've had some robotic probes on the surface of Mars analysing rocks and things, and it's pretty likely that they did come from Mars. I don't really doubt that.
Right. So how do they get here?
Yeah, how do they get here? That's right. I was just going on to that. So it would appear, because Mars has got very little atmosphere, it gets bombarded by asteroids and comets and other objects that are orbiting around the sun in our solar system.
Uh-huh.
And if one of those crashes into the planet's surface, it would create an enormous explosion. And Mars's gravity is quite weak. It's less than half the strength of the Earth's gravity. So it doesn't take that much to eject some rocks out of Mars and then into orbit around the sun. And these, some of them, fortuitously end up penetrating our atmosphere and arriving on the Earth.
Wow.
As meteorites. So I've got about 300 of these, I think, have been collected, and they, I think that they're most likely from Mars. I don't doubt that at all. But it's just interesting that the ages they find are much younger. But I guess what it does is just highlight the difficulty of dating things, because dating methods always involve assumptions, and when scientists make assumptions, they just make those assumptions reflect what they already believe about the ages.
Mm.
So, for instance, they're not going to come up with an age of just a few thousand years because they think, oh, well, that's obviously wrong. So they would reject such a result.
Yeah. I mean, when we were talking to Dr. Taz Walker a few weeks back, he was talking about, rocks and how they sort of measure the ages and how there's so many sort of, I guess, problems with trying to measure the amount of something in a rock and saying it's this old. And then we get these headlines, which is basically proving that, the aging methods that they're using are inconsistent or just plain wrong, yet they don't seem to change their dating methods.
Well, it's interesting that here on Earth we've been able to date volcanic rocks, for instance, from lava, where lava has solidified from a volcanic eruption at known date. And when you do that, you know when the lava solidified, and there's a clock called the potassium-argon clock that starts ticking when the rock solidifies.
Yep.
And potassium-argon dates from lava domes with known ages come out completely wrong. So it does really, raise the question, if you get inaccurate results for rocks that have a known age, how can you have confidence in the results you get for rocks that have an unknown age?
Yeah.
So it really is a challenge. The problem is people think that scientists can measure age, but they actually can't. You have to calculate the ages, and to calculate them you have to make assumptions, and your assumptions always will reflect what you already believe. So if they believe the billions of years, then those assumptions will reflect what they believe.
Yeah.
So in effect, the dating methods are influenced by the scientist's worldview, his belief system.
Yeah, and I mean, from our point of view, a Christian's point of view, we sort of say we know that God put this together 6,500 years ago. Well, he created those rocks with the exact amount of element in there.
That's right.
Yeah, they'll look like a certain age anyway, won't they?
Well, they will, and sometimes people say, when the Earth was created, it would have looked old. But I think a better way to describe it is that it would have been functionally mature. So, for instance, Adam and Eve would have been mature adults. They weren't babies.
Yep.
They would have been surrounded by trees in the garden, which would normally have taken, say, 50 years to grow or something. So it was functionally mature. In a sense, it looked old, I guess. But not old in the sense of deep time, the millions and millions of years.
Yeah. And I guess I still find it interesting that they can tell us how long a half-life is if something has got, millions of years half-life. It's like, well, how do they even...
I guess the way they get to that is just through knowledge of the physics of how the atom works and the processes of decay. I'm reasonably relaxed about those because I think it's based on some pretty good observational science. Observational not of the half-life, but observations of the processes within atoms from which they infer a half-life. So the half-lives are probably correct, but that doesn't mean that they've been around that long, of course.
Yeah.
And in the case of something like Mars, the Bible tells us that God made the sun, moon, and the stars, which would have included the planets, on the fourth day of creation week. And that was only about 6,000 years ago, as we said.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, we're going to go into a little break right now. And if anybody does have any questions, please send them through to us. 0401 949 949. That's a text line. So SMS 0401 949 949. We're on the line with Creation Ministries International. We have Dr. Mark Harwood on the line. And, he's been talking to us about, well, stuff in space today, which has been pretty cool. And if you have any questions for us about maybe anything else in space, give us send us a message on our text line, 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. Mark, we've been talking about some of the news that's just come out in the last week. And another story that I noticed, and we all know that the asteroid Bennu had a human intervention in the last year or so, and they've brought some samples of this little asteroid back to Earth to have a bit of a look at. And the headline on 9 News was, "Asteroid Sample Holds Building Blocks of Life." That almost sounds as though they've just found life on another planet or on an asteroid.
They would lead you to think that, wouldn't they, with those kinds of headlines? What you're looking at there is some amazing technology and science and engineering. To have actually intercepted the asteroid, to have landed on it, to have taken a sample and then successfully got it back to Earth is quite amazing. But all of that kind of science is what you call operational science. It's based on observable experiments, That's what real science is about. But when it comes to trying to figure out where life came from, we're now sort of getting into what you could call historical science, where scientists try to recreate or understand what happened right back at the beginning. But the problem is you can't observe beginnings. And so what you really need is an eyewitness account of what happened. And I think as a Christian that we have that eyewitness account in the Bible, God's Word. And it tells us that God created the heavens and the earth in just 6 days, about 6,000 years ago. And that's a very different story from what we're told in our culture. So when people find things like the building blocks of life, they get very excited because they think, wow, now we've figured out how life arose on Earth. And the origin of life is one of the most profound mysteries that people have struggled with. They try and explain it in natural terms, the idea being that if we can do that somehow, then we will have done away for the need for there to be a creator God.
Yep.
And I think that's what we're talking about here. That's why all the excitement. So if they find a couple of elements like or molecules like water, and I think they found some carbon in it. Of course, life is carbon-based here on Earth, and we have a watery planet. Something like 70% or a bit more than that of the surface of our planet is covered in water. But the problem is, in the Big Bang story, Earth started out as a molten ball. So if there was any water to begin with, it would have all just boiled off.
Yep.
So where did our oceans come from? Where did we get all this water?
Yeah.
And the kind of theories are, well, maybe all these comets and asteroids and things bombarded the Earth. They all had some water in them, usually locked inside the minerals.
But hang on, if they all came from the same Big Bang, shouldn't their water have all evaporated off as well?
Well, there's a long story there. You see, the idea is that originally stars formed up made out of hydrogen and helium, and then they exploded at the end of their lives, and that caused larger, heavier elements to be formed. And that cycle repeats and repeats, and finally you get things like oxygen, and then in the right environment you can get oxygen and hydrogen combining, and you get water. and then ultimately this water ends up trapped in things like asteroids, and then they collide with the Earth and the water gets released, and after millions and millions of years, hey presto, we have oceans on planet Earth. But it really is not a very plausible story at all. If you start looking at the number of collisions you have to have and all this sort of thing, it's quite preposterous. And there are lots of other things that are wrong with the whole idea of heavy elements being formed by stellar explosions too. And look, people can find a lot of stuff on our website at creation.com that explains that. But just back to the claim, if you find the building blocks of life, if you found, for instance, that somebody on a vacant block of land had left a pile of bricks and bits of timber, would you for a moment think that somehow or other by accident a house would one day appear? Well, of course not. Somebody has to come and construct it. So even if you did have the building blocks of life, how do you assemble them?
Yeah.
Actually, I would question. Water and carbon is nowhere near sufficient for the building blocks of life. There's another, massive leap yet to go.
Yes.
But the assembly requires intelligence. No complex thing happens by chance. You need a set of plans to build a house. You need intelligence. Someone has to draw the plans, and someone has to assemble the raw materials in accordance with the plans.
Yeah.
Now, all that means that there's a lot of information around, particularly in living things. And in fact, there's a scientist called an Australian guy, Professor Paul Davies, and he makes the point that life is like a supercomputer. It's an information processing system. So it's the software of the living cell that is the real mystery, not the hardware. So it's not just the bits and pieces you have to assemble together, but a living cell is controlled by this stored program that's in the DNA. And that tells the machinery inside the cell what they have to do and when and so on, so the cell fulfills all its functions. So the challenge is, who wrote the program? It's where does the software come from?
Yes, absolutely.
So it's a long, long way.
Yeah, and we know that there's a lot more in a living organism than there is in a house if you break them down into their elements.
Absolutely. A house can't reproduce itself, but a living organism can.
Yes.
Which is absolutely amazing in its complexity.
Yes.
And all of that is programmed onto the DNA. So, it's just, it's a bit of a giggle in a way because they've just got so far to go and they're not even close.
Absolutely. Now, Dr. Mark, we have a question here. It says, "Hi, Dr. Mark. We have a 100-year-old gold fob pocket watch at home. It still works fine. Open the back and the watch mechanism can be seen working. The spring, balance wheel, the gearing, etc. The mathematics involved, the engineering for the hands to go round in 24 hours. Thinking of the universe, is there an understandable balance in the interactive balance of mass, gravity, distance between planets and stars, velocity through space that can be understood the same way as a pocket watch?" That's a big question. Did you get all that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a great analogy. There was a guy called William Paley in the 1800s who drew the analogy of a complex thing like a watch. So if you stumbled over a watch somewhere in the middle of a field, you would not think for a moment that it happened by chance. You would realise that it obviously had been designed and made because of its complexity. And so when we look at living things that we've just been talking about, you see vastly more complex systems. So it makes a lot of sense to assume that it was designed. And if it was designed, that means there must be a designer.
Yes.
And that, of course, we would argue would be the God of the Bible who created this universe.
Yeah.
In fact, God says that he didn't make the earth to be an empty, waste place, but he formed it to be inhabited. So he's made the earth and he's made mankind for his glory. So, you see the analogy, and it's actually a very good analogy. It's very strong. And how far would it be if you just found one cog and one piece of the spring, which is kind of like what these guys have found on this little asteroid Bennu? There's still so far away from having something which is a living, self-replicating cell.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the challenges, in assembling things like a watch is this concept of irreducible complexity. There's a couple of big words there, but basically what it means is that things, living things in particular, have a certain degree of complexity, and you can't make them any simpler. So if you think about your eye, for instance, it's got a lens and it's got a retina, and then there's an optic nerve which goes to a special part of your brain which interprets the signals so that the whole system works together so you can see.
Yep.
But if you took one part of that system away, the eye would not work.
Yeah.
It would be of no value to the organism at all. So it's not like you can build complex systems little piece by little piece, which is what Darwin thought you might be able to do.
Yeah.
You have to have the entire system all built together. In fact, Darwin recognised this problem. He actually said, and I'll quote this because it's a good thing, and he was thinking clearly. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, at that stage, he did not know about how cells worked and all the detailed information that we've now got the privilege of knowing through our technology.
Yep.
Had he known all of those things, I really wonder if he would have come up with such a theory at all.
Yeah.
Because the watch analogy is a great example. Even if you did have all the cogs, and by the way, where would they have come from? You still have to assemble them in the right sequence, and it all has to be operating together before it will tell the time.
Yeah. I can remember back in the 1970s, I had a neighbour when we lived out at Palmdale here on the Central Coast. And he had gone up to, he was an architect, he'd gone up to Mount Hagen in New Guinea, and he'd been working up there for 12 months. He worked with sort of building, I think they built a school and a hospital and stuff like that. And he was living with a tribe that pretty much had no education as we know education. They'd had their own sort of education. Yeah. But he came back with Chris when he came back to Australia the following year. And I remember his first day in Sydney. Chris and this little fella from the tribe up there went for a walk through Sydney, and apparently this little guy ran out into the middle of the street and he lied down in the middle of the street. Chris was freaking out because there's cars and everything everywhere, but he lied down in the middle of the street and he was looking up at these huge, giant buildings. And in a sort of a broken, I think they speak a type of pidgin English, he was trying to ask Chris, how did those buildings grow like that? And he really thought they had somehow like some sort of crystal structure had grown into these big buildings, and he was absolutely blown away and couldn't understand how it all worked. And, I mean, it's the same sort of thing. It didn't work. There was somebody who knew what they were doing actually built those buildings. But it's just as unbelievable.
It is. And those buildings, of course, can't reproduce.
Yes.
So they're nowhere near as complex as a single living cell.
No.
One of the challenges that biologists have is trying to understand how is it that the information for making parts of the cell is encoded on the DNA, and you have to have a little machine that reads the DNA.
Yep.
But the information for making that machine is itself encoded on the DNA.
Yes.
So somehow or other you have to read the code to make the machine to read the code. But how do you start that cycle? It's a vicious circle, and there's no way into it. There was a very famous scientist, his name was George Wald. He received the Nobel Prize for his research work in biology, I think it was. But he actually admitted, he says, one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task, that is to produce life from non-life, to concede that the spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. And you think, wow, he's actually got it. Someone's finally figured that it can't be done. But this is the bit that gets me. He then went on and said, yet here we are as a result, I believe, of spontaneous generation.
Yeah.
So isn't that amazing? So he says, look, it's impossible, but I believe that's how we got here.
Yeah.
So he actually had to switch his brain off from logic. And he looks at the incredible complexity and he realizes you cannot produce a self-replicating cell from non-living matter all by itself through chance random processes. In other words, evolution.
Yeah.
You know, I think I'm reminded of the scripture in Romans chapter 1 where it says, professing to be wise, they became fools. So what happens is people get a commitment to trying to explain the universe without God, which is what evolution is about. But you get yourself into all kinds of knots because there are no explanations that satisfy any scientific view, frankly, or make any sense at all of the evidence that we can actually see and measure. And yet people cling to it.
Yep.
And you think, why do people do that? And I think the reason, Mick, is that they have I suppose it's a philosophical commitment to rejecting God.
Yeah.
I guess it's a spiritual thing. They say, I refuse to believe there's a God, therefore I must believe that the universe happened by chance through random natural processes. There cannot be a God. And I think the reason they don't want a God is because if there is a God, well, he made me, and maybe I will be called to account for how I've lived my life.
Mm.
And, you know, I reckon that's behind a lot of the rejection of what the Bible says. People just don't want there to be a God.
It's a pity that a lot of people don't realise they can be forgiven for everything.
Absolutely. And when you look at the world around us, you see how amazingly and beautifully it's made, even though it has been marred and broken by sin. But it's so evident that God is a good God in how he's created us, our bodies, and the earth as a home for us to live. It's a Goldilocks planet, you know, everything is just right for life to thrive. So it's clear that he's a good God. And the Bible tells us that it was our rebellion against him that led to death and suffering and all the bad stuff coming into the world. But as it says in John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that's Jesus, who came and paid the price for us so that we could go free. Yeah. And it's an amazing gospel message that we have to proclaim. And everything that we see in the world around us, all of nature, living things, you know, planets like Mars and the asteroids and all this stuff, all speak of the glory of God and that he is a good creator.
Absolutely. Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow. Another awesome week. Dr. Mark Harwood from Creation Ministries International, we thank you so much. And I'm already looking forward to next week. You'll be back with us again next week for the last time before Christmas.
Looking forward to that, Mick.
It'll be awesome. Thank you again. If you do have any questions for Dr. Mark Harwood next week, please send them through to our text line 0401 949 949.